I noticed that the realtor's sign out front had been changed from for sale to sold. I had known the man who had lived there. He had passed away from the Big C not long into the new year, and his children had put the place on the market. It had been snapped up quickly. That didn't surprise me. It had what the realtors called character and charm. All I knew about the new owner was their surname and that they had sounded stressed on the phone when they had called to tell me something was scrabbling and scratching in their basement in the night. They were worried. I was not. I already had a pretty good idea of what the problem was and how to fix it. I parked up in front of the house, I climbed out and knocked on the door. The man who answered was in his 40s and looked tense. He had bags under his eyes and he kept clenching and unclenching his fingers. He had a full-on case of critter-induced stress. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Dave, your pest control specialist." These houses all had the same layout and I had been in enough of them to already know where the basement door was and what I would be looking for in it. But I didn't interrupt as the new owner pointed out the way. I placed great value on being respectful to my customers. I thanked him and headed down. He followed. He was very tentative and kept glancing back as if to check the door was still open in case he needed to make a rapid exit. And there was a light switch at the base of the basement stairs, so I kept my flashlight in my utility belt and I flicked it on. I had smelt the rodent droppings from the top of the stairs. Each of the dozens of dark pellets scattered around the basement floor were around 3/4 of an inch long with blunt ends. I put my best professional understanding smile on my face, turned to the man and said, "You have rats, but you don't need to worry about them anymore. I'll clean the basement to ensure there's no danger of disease and put down snap traps along the walls. The rats are partial to peanut butter and I keep a jar in my truck for baiting the traps with. I'll also seal up the basement where they're getting in by using a fine steel mesh." He looked both nauseated and relieved and his voice was shaky when he asked, "But where are they getting in? There are no holes that I can see." "Let me show you," I said, and I made my way over to a corner. If you didn't know that it was there, it was easy to miss the hatch in the floor. I brushed years of dust off with my hand, revealing it and the narrow gap around its edges, and then lifted the hatch. I clicked on my flashlight now and pointed it through the opening. "And that, sir, is a smuggler's tunnel. Leads from the caves on the beach and was used in the 18th century to help move tobacco ashore without paying tax. Once it was in the house, the tobacco could be sold in taverns." He shook his head and said, "Well, I'll be darned." I grinned and told him, "And nowadays, as you've seen, it's the rats that use them as highways, before squeezing through any gaps they can find to look for food. And like I say, it's simple enough to turn this particular route into a dead-end street." Still shaking his head, he thanked me and left me to it. I had finished in no time at all and headed back out to my car with the satisfaction of another job well done. As I unlocked my car, I saw a large ship passing by in the distance. It was following a local shipping lane that was used by commercial vessels carrying containers, oil, and, according to gossip in the local bar, and dangerous chemicals, maybe even nuclear waste. The town drunks were usually full of baloney, so I didn't worry about their wilder theories. I also had more down-to-earth concerns at that moment in time. I had been up working since 6 a.m. and was ravenous. With my gut rumbling, I got in the car and set off for Sally's diner. It was quiet when I got there. The waitress, Julie, was clearing a table. A couple of cops I knew were demolishing pancake stacks. Tom Joyce, a Navy veteran who had prided himself on being the town's unofficial historian, was at his usual seat making the most of the free coffee refills, and the man himself was stationed at his grill turning burgers. Sally had been running the diner since his pop had keeled over from a heart attack while at the very same grill. It was how he would have wanted to go, was Sally's take at the time. Thinking of my arteries, I had switched my order to grilled cheese on rye with a side of salad for a while after Sally's Pop's demise, but it wasn't long before I was back on the bacon and burgers and eggs. I didn't drink strong liquor or smoke, so I figured I was allowed one vice. "Dave," Sally called out when he saw me and put more patties on the grill. I shot a grin his way. The cops, Josh and Dwayne, nodded in my direction as they kept shoveling in pancakes. The town was too small to have its own police station, and law enforcement officers spent more time here visiting Sally's than they did dealing with the occasional minor crime. I nodded back at the officers and took a seat by the window. The view from where I was sitting was dominated by the old abandoned lighthouse that stood on the coast. I didn't think much of this relic, but I knew that the lighthouse was one of Tom's favorite subjects, and that it was better not to mention it unless you wanted a lecture. That morning, a flock of seagulls was circling the lighthouse. There was an outcrop of rock a mile and a quarter out to sea where the gulls had nested and raised their young, and that meant there were a lot of them hereabouts. A number of folks regarded them as pests, and I did get call-outs when gulls tipped over bins on refuse collection days and congregated around the garbage. Poisoning or shooting gulls was illegal, so there wasn't a lot that I could do, apart from sound a klaxon and wave my arms at the critters. Sometimes that cleared them out. Sometimes they just gave me a filthy look and then went back to picking through the trash. Live and let scavenge, I figured. And then my attention was drawn away from the view out the window to the much more pleasing sight of Sally carrying over a plate loaded with a triple-stacked burger, fries, and onion rings. I loosened my belt in anticipation of this gut-busting feast and was about to tuck in when my cell phone rang. I could have let it ring. I was not a first attender on call or a father-to-be waiting on news that his partner's gone into labor. But I took the call because when you were a small business owner and operator like me, you always needed the work. After I'd taken down the details, I looked longingly at the food. Thankfully, Sally was, as ever, on the ball. He had put the burger and sides in a bag to go, added a takeaway coffee, and told me that I could pay later. I high-fived him and went to work. The address that I had been given was an apartment complex on the west side of town. When I arrived, my new customer buzzed me in, and I headed through to their ground floor apartment. The situation she had described over the phone sounded bad. She had not been exaggerating. There was a nauseating smell and a dark stain on the ceiling of her front room. A thick cloud of flies gathered around the stain. "I called you because of the flies," she said. "You can get rid of them, right?" I answered as truthfully and tactfully as I could. "The flies will go once the underlying problem is dealt with." I didn't tell her what I believed that problem might be. I asked her instead, "Do you know your upstairs neighbor?" "No," she answered. "I've just moved to town to work at a public library and I don't really know anyone yet. I know it's a man and I think he lives alone." "And have you heard him moving around upstairs recently?" I asked. She scrunched up her face as she thought. "I guess not," she eventually replied. This added weight to my fears. I told her that I thought the stain was coming through from the apartment above and that I would go up there now. As I trudged upstairs, I phoned Sally's diner. Julie answered and I asked her if Josh and Dwayne were still there. I was in luck. They had just asked for the bill. Now, I could and maybe should have phoned 911 and reported my concerns, but the system's wheels turned slow and the smell would have gotten riper, the stain wider, and the flies would have increased in number by the time a patrol car was finally dispatched to the address. This way was much quicker. I asked Julie to call one of the officers over to the phone. A couple of minutes later, Josh was on the other end of the line asking, "You got a problem, Dave?" "I think so," I answered. "Maybe a good idea for you two to roll out to the apartment complex on the west side and do a welfare check." I explained why. After patiently listening, Josh said that they'd be there in around 20 minutes. They needed to call the sheriff's office first and pass on the details. I tell you, those were a long 20 minutes, and when I heard the sound of police boots heading up the stairs, I was mighty relieved. Josh and his partner followed procedure. After identifying themselves and receiving no reply, they forced the door. Both immediately put their hands to their mouths and looked like they were going to hurl. The stench of decay was so powerful that it was almost like you were being assaulted, and the flies were everywhere in the apartment. They covered the walls and ceiling and floor, and they covered the object laying in the hallway. The dead man was on his back. He was clothed in flies and maggots, and he lay in a pool of fluids that had leached from his body and gone through to the ceiling below. Josh was calling it in. He and Dwayne were on either side of the thing that had once been a human, looking down at it. I wanted to look away now, but I couldn't. I was gripped by morbid fascination. And I was still staring at the putrefying corpse when it raised an arm, and when its fingers spread, it was reaching out for help. I realized with a jolt of terror, he was reaching out for help. He was somehow still alive. The officers and I were frozen to the spot with shock, and we were still standing there staring as the arm sunk slowly back to the ground, where it remained. Josh was the first to react. He leaned down and felt for a pulse through the flies. He straightened up and shook his head. In a quiet, strained voice, he said, "No sign of life. Must have been a freak occurrence, his arm moving like that." "Yeah, that must have been it," his partner added. They sounded like they were trying to convince themselves, and I was not going to argue. When they told me that I could leave and that they'd contact me later to get a statement, I didn't hesitate. I found myself back at Sally's with no memory of the drive there. I guessed that I had automatically headed somewhere that I felt safe. The burger and sides were still in a bag on the passenger seat. I had completely lost my appetite now, and I took it out and put it in the dumpster. Then I carried my coffee over to one of the tables that sat out the back of Sally's. They had a good view of the sea and were popular in the summer, but it was early in the year and too cold for sitting outside in normal circumstances. That afternoon, the chilly breeze from the sea and the fresh air were exactly what I needed. My hands shook as I lifted the coffee and took a sip. Sally's coffee always tasted good, and that first taste helped. Things improved again when I noticed Sally had left the diner and was heading over to join me. As he took the weight off, he said, "Julie told me you called and spoke to Josh. Sounded serious, and she's been worrying about you since. When I saw you out here, I decided to take a break and check on ya." And despite of everything that had happened, I couldn't help but smile. Julie was beautiful and totally out of my league, but a man could dream, and Sally was a good friend. I told Sally, "I'll be fine." Sally wasn't the hugging type, and neither was I, so we bumped fists and shared a quiet moment looking out to the sea. We both noticed the fog at the same time. It was no big deal. Sea fogs could appear out of nowhere and drift in at speed. They'd blanket the town, and for a short while it would be hard to make out the buildings, but then the fog would break up. Only there was something different about this fog. It was hard to put my finger on what that was at first, and then Sally said, "It's moving too slow. It looks darker as well." His voice trailed off. I could see that he looked worried. I was also unsettled. Sally was right. This bank of dark gray approaching the coast was definitely not like any sea fog that I had ever seen. I was wondering what it was when an emergency alert began to sound on my cell phone. The same sound was blaring from Sally's cell. I checked the screen and read the message that said a chemical leak from a seagoing vessel had created a potentially toxic cloud that was being carried by the prevailing winds towards town. Residents were advised to stay indoors and close all windows. Sally looked up from the screen on his cell phone and said to me, "You should shelter in place in the diner." There was no way that I could have driven home safely in time, and so I told Sally, "You're on." And we hurried inside. Julie was by the counter looking all worried. Her cell was in her hand, so she must have seen the same message as me and Sally. Tom was there as well. He didn't seem concerned about the toxic cloud heading away. It was business as usual for the old amateur historian, as he took his time over his latest coffee and read a hefty-looking book. Sally said to all of us, "We'll head to the basement until the risk is past. It'll be safer down there." Tom looked up from his book and asked, "What on earth are you talking about?" I was about to tell him to check his phone, and then it occurred to me why that would be pointless. Tom basically lived in the past and he didn't own a cell phone. I couldn't bring him into the 21st century, but I did bring him up to speed. And grumbling about safety standards today and how much better things used to be, he followed as Sally led us down to the basement. The stairs were steep and worn and brought us out into a large space with a low ceiling. A single light bulb hanging on a cord illuminated empty containers of frying oil, old pallets, and other junk. A freezer made a humming sound in one corner. In the opposite corner, I noticed a hatch for a smuggler's tunnel. I had never had cause to come down to Sally's basement before, but I wasn't surprised there was a hatch. It wouldn't have been a diner back in the day, but the building was in the right place for smugglers to bring their goods through without drawing the attention of the revenue men. Sorry, it's not very comfortable," Sally said, "but pull up a pallet and try to take it easy while the cloud passes." Making the best of a lousy situation, we all did. None of us spoke. Everyone looked lost in their own worrying thoughts. I was busy wondering what the toxic elements of the chemical were, and what the symptoms might be if you breathed some in or got some on your skin. Sally's thoughts, it turned out, were going in a different direction. He cleared his throat, and after making sure that he had our attention, he said, "Of course, you know what's going to happen now." 3 puzzled faces looked back at him. He put his hands on his knees, leaned forwards, and said in a very serious tone, "The dead will rise. It's the chemical cloud you see. It'll animate the bones of the long-dead smugglers and the corpses of the fishermen who went overboard in storms, and they will come staggering out of the sea and head straight for the diner. And do you know what I'll do?" 3 now very pale faces stared back at him. Sally said, "And tell them they're welcome to come in as long as they order something to eat." And then he grinned. Julie, Tom, and I remained ashen-faced for a moment, and then we got it. He was yanking our chain. Sally started to laugh out loud. "No, I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself. I love all them old horror stories where a mysterious fog drifts over a small seaside town and, before you know it, it's zombie central." And Julie went over to Sally and playfully punched him on the shoulder. "That was mean," she said. "I believed you." And she was now smiling though, and me and Tom were as well. Sally had definitely lifted the mood. I think because of this, the time passed quicker. And those of us with cell phones had no reception, but at regular intervals, one of us would venture almost to the top of the stairs and hold our phone up to get a signal. We had each made 4 trips when Julie, whose turn it was, called back down. "I've got a message saying that it's all clear." The 4 of us headed back up to the surface. The message was accurate and there was no sign of any cloud. To celebrate, Sally put a fresh pot of coffee on. I had 1 cup, but then I had to leave. I had a new call out. The man who had phoned lived in a sprawling house on the edge of town. It was high up and had a really good view of the sea. My latest customer was an artist or a writer, I wasn't sure. He was definitely high-strung, and he was one of the townsfolk who had previously called me to deal with gulls poking through his garbage. Today was not garbage collection day as far as I knew, but when he had called me, he had said there were gulls in his backyard and that they needed dealing with. I let him know that I would be with him promptly, and I was good to my word. I pulled up in front of his property and knocked on his front door. When I got no answer, I went around to his backyard, where a corpse lay on the ground. It was hideously mutilated. It looked like the flesh had been ripped from the bone until all that was left was blood-stained scraps. There were no gulls, though at that moment in time I was so horrified that they were the last thing on my mind. I stumbled back around the front and towards my car. As I did, my cell phone began to ring. It was Josh. The policeman sounded breathless when he said, "Dave, there are gulls in the town center, a lot of them, and they're acting aggressive. Could you get here ASAP and desist?" I must have sounded like a 60-a-day chain smoker when I replied hoarsely, "Sure." The call ended. After it had, I thought how I should have told Josh about my grisly discovery. I figured I would do that when I saw him, and I got in my car. As I descended towards the town center, I noticed gulls circling high above, and I could hear their piercing calls. Nearing the main strip, I saw more and more of the critters, in the air and perched on rooftops. Every avian voice was raised. It was a hideous, jarring noise. I tried to block it out and slowed, turning into the heart of town. I saw Josh and Dwayne's police cruiser. It was parked by the sidewalk. Josh and Dwayne were in the car, and even from a distance, I could see that they were afraid. I could see more badly frightened people looking out of the windows of the buildings that ran along the street as well. I understood their fear. Seagulls lined every roof. They lined the sidewalks. And overhead, the flock of circling, shrieking seagulls was growing ever denser. My gut instinct was telling me to floor the pedal to the metal and get away from there. But Josh and Dwayne had asked for my help. And just as importantly, this was my small hometown, where I was the respected go-to guy for dealing with pests. If I drove away now in full view of so many witnesses, I had better keep driving and set up shop in some other town where nobody knew me. I wasn't going to do that. No way. Having said that, I did not suddenly turn into a hero. I carefully parked up and made sure that all the car windows were firmly closed, and I phoned Josh. He answered on the first ring and launched straight into a question. "Why are they behaving like this?" I told him, "I have no idea." I did not like this answer any more than I had expected he did, but it was the truth, and this was not the time for BS. I could suggest a course of action though. There were no guarantees, but if the police car's siren was set to maximum wail, and horns were sounded, engines revved, and even police-issued guns discharged to add to the noise, then maybe, just maybe, the seagulls would disperse. I was about to tell Josh this when the truck drove into view. It was Paul Mitchell's truck. He owned a rundown farm outside of town and was known for having a hair-triggered temper, especially when he had a drink. He mainly kept to himself though, and only came into town now and then for supplies or to take up residence in a corner of the bar. He must have seen and heard the seagulls and was driving slowly, gawping at them as he did. Now, there's some in town that say Mitchell was born with more stringy muscle than brain, and I guessed he proved them right because he pulled up, turned his engine off, and got out of his truck. He stood there in the open looking around at the seagulls as if they were the star attraction in a freak show that had rolled into town. I noticed the gulls on the sidewalk and the nearby rooftops were observing him as well, through eyes that shone dark, and that they had fallen silent. A silence that was broken by Mitchell. "You sure is ugly. Ugly and dumb. And you better get out of my way, 'cause I've got a thirst on me and there's no creature that'll stop my constitutional right to get wasted." He swayed on his feet as he yelled, and I reckoned any drinking he'd been planning on doing would just be topping up the tank. He waved a fist and then at the gulls closest to him, and started to stumble towards the bar. and then he swore and kicked out at one of the critters. He missed it by a country mile, but it was like a switch had been turned. They all went for him. The ones on the sidewalk flapped their wings and shrieked and ran at him. The gulls on the nearby rooftops left their perches and descended on him. Within seconds, he was surrounded, and they were stabbing him with their sharp beaks, striking him with their wings, scratching with the hooked claws on their feet. He swung his arms at them and cussed, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. He was just one man at the center of a storm of crazed gulls. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Josh and Dwayne opening their car doors. Both of them had their weapons drawn. As officers of the law, I figured they felt that they had to try to intervene. It would be a bad move. The last they ever made I knew, because I now understood what had happened to the man in his backyard and what was about to happen to Mitchell. I called Josh and told him, "They'll attack you both as well, kill you and tear the flesh from your bones. Best thing you can do for yourself and the good people of this town is to keep your doors locked." Josh had not spoken and did not do so as he closed his door. Dwayne followed suit. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief, because this nightmare was not over. It was only getting started. And gulls were scavengers and gulls were killers, but ordinary ones would only attack and kill other smaller birds. Sometimes they would cannibalize each other. They were vicious, no question about that. These ones were different. They must have been changed by the toxic cloud into the critters that I was watching slaughtering another human. There were so many gulls by now around Mitchell that I could barely make them out. I saw hands reaching out for help. I glimpsed his face and saw sheer terror, and I saw blood flowing. It decorated the beaks and feathers of the gulls as they tore Mitchell to pieces. I could see chunks of flesh held in beaks. I could see an eye trailing nerves after being plucked out. I could see a coil of intestine. Every gruesome mortal was swallowed down. Around the edges of the abhorrent maelstrom, more gulls bickered and fought. Slivers of human flesh that had been dropped became prizes to be captured. Eventually, though, the gulls began to move away. The feast was over, the carcass picked clean. And Mitchell was left as a skeleton, dyed red with blood and lying on the sidewalk. The bones of the skeleton's hands still reached out, but it was too late for any help to be found in this mortal world. And the skull stared as sightlessly at the gulls as they stood on the sidewalk and flew lazily back up to the rooftops. The rest of them, and there were hundreds and hundreds now, remained circling above. They were a plague, a terror from which we were all in danger. My idea of the police car sounding its siren and all the rest seemed useless now. I thought the only thing we could do was try and get away, and hope that help would arrive soon and decimate the killer seagulls. I called Josh again, needing him to tell me that they had contacted the sheriff's office, who had called the military, who were even now clamoring into trucks and about to speed our way. But my call did not connect. I looked at the screen of my cell phone and saw that I had no signal. With dread running ice cold through my veins, I realized why this might be. There was a cell phone tower just outside town. If the seagulls had descended on that, they could have taken it out, leaving us cut off. Unless Josh and Dwayne's police radio used a different system. I mean, surely it had to. Clinging onto this hope, I started my engine. Josh must have just been able to hear this over the noise of the gulls, because he turned to look in my direction. I pointed in front of me, trying to get across that it was time to drive into the sunset and save our hides. Josh responded by activating the siren speaker on the cruiser that was usually used to tell wayward drivers to pull over.
"Understood,"
his distorted voice said.
"You go, Dave, but we can't leave while there are people with no way to escape."
I made the OK sign with my fingers. Before I could set off, Josh spoke again through the siren speaker.
"Our radios are not working, Dave, and headquarters still thinks that this is just a pest problem. You need to get help.
I swore and hit the steering wheel. So much for the cavalry appearing to save the day. I was it instead, for now. I set off. Gulls had drifted into the road by now, and I drove slowly. After what I had just witnessed, I suppose that I should not have had any qualms about mowing them down. If any critters deserved to be left as roadkill, surely these did. But I was frightened of whooping them up into a frenzy again, so I crawled along, steering through the gaps in between them. One or two hopped out of the way. The others just stared up at me behind the wheel and shrieked. And then one of them jumped and flapped its wings and landed on the hood of my car. Its dark eyes stared through the windscreen. It was looking right at me. I shivered and tried to ignore it. It kept staring, its beak opened. It arched its head forwards and then it raised its wings and shrieked. I gripped the wheel tighter, as much to try and stop my hands from shaking as anything else. The gull had maintained its threatening posture but had fallen silent. It tilted its head to one side, seemed to me to be thinking, to be considering. And then it shrieked again, and this may have been a signal to its kin because another and then another gull landed on my hood. I heard the impact of more critters landing on the roof of the car just above my head. In the mirror, I could see more taking up residence on the trunk, and the road ahead of me was now thick with the critters. I panicked and started to reverse, but dozens of gulls swooped onto the road behind me, leaving me with no choice. I would have to drive through them to get away. "It's your funeral," I muttered under my breath and got ready to do this, and then I heard the sound of a man hollering in fear. I paused, glanced over, and somebody had opened the door of the general store and was running out into the street. It was a middle-aged man, overweight and shouting, "I can't take it. I gotta get out of here." As last words went, they were no great shakes. The gulls that had been blocking my way and the ones that had been in my car joined the horde of shrieking fiends that descended upon the man. One dug its beak into his eye, one ripped out his tongue. One dug its claws into his scalp and clung on as he fell to his knees. Dozens and dozens of gulls pierced and gouged and ripped away skin, fat, muscle, and organs. It was an aberration. They were monsters, and humans were their prey. We were forced to hide, cowering behind closed doors and glass, behind brick and metal frames. That was keeping us safe. That was the only saving grace. I was wrong. A gull broke off from the spiraling flock and flew at speed towards the window of the general store. It struck the glass, beak first, and it was thrown backwards. It staggered around on the sidewalk, clearly in a daze from the collision, and then it flapped its wings and shrieked. A second gull broke free from the flock and sped into the same shop window. A third followed, a fourth. On the other side of the glass, men and women watched, each strike through wide and terrified eyes. They would have seen the crack appear before I did. After 8, 9, 10 seagulls had hit the glass, I noticed the line of the fracture where the pane had given way under the sustained assault. I saw the people inside moving back. I knew there was a back door where the store owner brought in deliveries, but to go through that door would have led to an open alley, where more seagulls surely waited. There was no escape, and the crack was spreading, splitting, until the section of pane fell in. The opening was wide enough for the first of the gulls to squeeze through. A single seagull was not enough to cause a real problem. It was outnumbered for a start. Someone in the crowd inside tried to stamp on its head. Another person threw a can at it. If they had had time, they could have driven it away, but they were out of time. Another huge section of broken pane fell away and the gulls began to pour into the store. The people in the cafe opposite would have seen this as clearly as I did, and I guess they thought that this was their chance to escape. The seagulls were all focused on killing and feeding on the occupants of the general store. People began to stream out of the cafe. but the skies were rich with gulls and they were legion. And these gulls swooped down onto the fleeing people and they too began to kill and feast. And then gunfire cut through the sounds of the carnage. It was Josh and Dwayne. They had clearly reached the breaking point and couldn't just stay in their car anymore. They had their windows cracked open and they were firing through the gap. Each bullet unleashed found a mark. Gulls fell dead onto the ground. But Josh and Dwayne only had handguns and a limited supply of ammunition. They had been fighting a losing battle from the moment that they had first pulled the trigger. Gulls veered away from the obscene feast and rushed towards the police cruiser. 3 more were taken out by bullets. That was all. The gulls swarmed over the police cruiser. They attacked the windows, forced their beaks into the gaps. There were no more shots. I heard screaming come from under the mass of frenzied gulls. It was a sickening sound. Josh and Dwayne were both good men and they were dying and there was nothing that I could do. There was nothing that I could do for anyone here. I finally drove away. And driving like a lunatic, I smashed through any gulls that got in my way. The windscreen was soon smeared in blood. It made it hard to see, but that was not the problem. The gulls had me in their sights. They were battering the car with their bodies. And I knew that I wouldn't make it out of town alive to be able to alert the authorities. So I changed plans. It was time to save my own backside 101. Instinctively, I again headed to a place of safety. Well, somewhere that felt safe before my small corner of the world descended into primal savagery. I saw the diner coming up ahead. I was minutes away and pushing the speed to the max. The seagulls were now on my tail, but they'd catch back up in an instant. That was inevitable as night follows day. I sped into the diner's car park and parked by colliding with a wall. I leapt out and ran for the diner's door. It was locked. I couldn't see anybody inside, but I hollered for help. When Sally ran into sight and let me in, I could have kissed him. But there was no time for that. He grabbed my arm and said, "This way." He led me to the basement door and made sure that it was locked before we raced down the stairs. I emerged into the basement, breathless and dripping with sweat. The lone light bulb shone on the faces of Julie and Tom. Sally went to stand alongside them. He said, "I think we'll be safe down here." "Yeah, I reckon you're right," I told him. "And we've got food to see us through." I nodded at the freezer. Sally grimaced and then went over and pried open the lid. I joined him and looked in. The freezer was solid with ice. There were stacks of burgers visible, but they would take a flamethrower to even defrost. As I tried and failed to hide my disappointment, Julie said, "It'll be fine. Josh and Dwayne will have called for help. All we have to do is wait." I took a deep breath and told her what had happened. She started to cry. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I don't know what to do now." Tom said, "I do." He explained his idea to us. I thought that there was no way it could succeed, but I kept this to myself. From Julie and Sally's expression, they felt the same way, but we had nothing else. "So," Tom said, "let's do this thing." I opened up the hatch to the smuggler's tunnel. I turned on my flashlight and went down into the tunnel first. I used the flashlight to see where I was stepping and asked the others to keep as close behind as they could. We found ourselves in a cobwebbed-lined narrow space. As I took another hesitant step forward, I noticed something scurrying away. The rat glanced back in my direction. Its eyes shone red in the flashlight's beam, and then with a flick of its long tail, it was gone, lost in the darkness. I kept moving. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps of my friends on the stone of the tunnel floor. Water dripped from somewhere as well, and there was the smell of the sea. We were getting close, I hoped. And I felt a rush of hope when I saw natural light up ahead. I lowered the beam of the flashlight and set over my shoulder. I reckon the beach is a dozen paces away now. At the tunnel's end, the narrow, sandy beach would lead us to our final destination, and getting there in one piece was our next challenge. I stayed in the lead, not because I wanted to. I was not brave. It was just that I did not want to ask Tom, Julie, or Sally to change places with me. I had a real bad case of the shakes again as I clicked the flashlight off and stepped out into the open. It was sunset and the sky was streaked with red. There were no seagulls overhead at the moment. From the hideous shrieking sounds being carried from town, they were still fully occupied feeding on the carrion that had been our neighbors. When they had finished feeding and came looking for new prey, there would be nowhere to hide. We needed to hurry. I broke into a run. My chest burnt with the pain of fresh exertion. My legs felt like they were about to give way. The others were clearly struggling as well, but it was worth it. We had reached the lighthouse. The door was not locked, but I still had to put my shoulder against it and push hard to open it enough to squeeze through. The place hasn't been used in 40 years, Tom said as we made our way in. The air was damp and cold, and our footsteps echoed through the darkness as we ascended the winding stone staircase, our way once more guided by my flashlight. There were a lot of steps, and I was running on empty by the time that we had reached the top. Narrow windows lined the curving wall. The stone they were set in was thick and the glass looked solid. There was also a door which led to the platform which ringed the outside of the lighthouse. "And this is it," Tom said. "Now give me your flashlight." I held on to it at first and I asked him, "You sure about this?" He replied, "I've never been more sure about anything in my life." I could see the spark in his eyes. I could see this old mariner was not to be denied. I handed over the flashlight and I wished him good luck. He went through the door, closed it firmly behind him, and went to carry out his plan. Back in the basement of the diner, he had told us how he was going to send an SOS signal in Morse code to these ships passing by. Once he had made contact, he would send a detailed message explaining what was unfolding and plead for help to be sent. I hurried over to one of the narrow windows. It was almost dark now, and Tom was a lone form outlined against the rising night. He was standing on the platform and was pointing the flashlight out to sea. And though I could not see the flashlight flickering as he called for help, I knew if anybody could do it, he could. He needed to do it quickly though, because I saw a streak of movement in the sky. My heart sank. It was a gull. I knew they must have finished their feast and this critter was the first to come this way looking for new prey, and that Tom was totally exposed out there. Sally was looking through another window. Echoing my fears, he muttered, "Hurry, man, hurry." There were more gulls in the sky now. Tom must have seen them, but he was still focused on sending the message. "Come on," I said under my breath. The gulls were multiplying in number and beginning to shriek. They were circling the lighthouse and circling Tom. It all happened very quickly after that. The first of the gulls swooped and attacked. Tom could have used the flashlight as a weapon to defend himself, but he didn't waver from his task. More gulls spiraled down, and I could see their claws dig into him and their beaks strike. He held his stance, but the numbers of them descending on him from the sky and the savagery of the assault kept increasing. And then Sally shouted, "I gotta go help him. I'll bring him back inside." He was through the door and out before I could react. I watched in horror as the gulls now turned on him. Sally was surrounded by them and he was trying to fight them off, but there was no hope. He collapsed under a storm of gulls, and Tom was already lost to sight, and now Sally was gone as well. I didn't know if they were still alive. A part of me hoped they were not, because dead men feel no pain. My eyes filling with tears, I looked away. Julie was over by the door checking that it was firmly closed so that none of the gulls could get in. The windows were too narrow and the glass too thick for them to get in that way, and the stone walls of the lighthouse had stood strong for over 100 years. We were safe and left to wonder if Tom had succeeded, and there was nothing else that we could do but wait. We sat with our backs against a wall, and after a while, Julie rested her head on my shoulder. Outside, I could hear the gulls shrieking and pictured them circling and waiting for their prey. The night passed slow and cold. When I saw the first light of dawn through one of the windows, I got unsteadily to my feet. The gulls were still there and they were still circling. And then I heard the roar of a thunderstorm, or at least that's what I thought it was. And then I saw gulls scattering, gulls being cut down, and gulls falling to the ground, their bodies shredded. The helicopter gunship soared over the lighthouse a moment later. I ran across to the other side and saw it turn and begin to open fire once more on them. A wave of relief passed through me. Tom had succeeded. Help was here, and all the seagulls would be exterminated, at the cost of his life and Sally's. The sadness mingled with the relief of knowing that it was going to be okay. I realized Julie was beside me. She took my hand and said, "The nightmare is over." It was, but I knew even then that for the rest of my life I would be watching the skies for a gull circling. I would be listening out for a gull's piercing call. I would always be afraid.